Before she begins, just to kind of give you a heads up on the schedule, Ms. Murphy's going to make her closing statement to you. Then we're going to take a recess while the defense prepares, and then we'll bring you back in and we'll hear the defense's closing statement and then the state's reply. Counsel, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I have my PowerPoint published onto the screens?
Yes. Are the monitors up in the jury box? Okay. Go ahead, counsel.
Good morning. Let me begin by thanking you again. This has been a long several days. You've seen a lot of evidence. I think there's 91 exhibits, some of them with many, many photos on those discs. You've reviewed hundreds of pages of records, and you've been very attentive throughout, and we thank you for your time and attention in this case. Let's talk about what this case is about and what the state has done to prove its burden beyond a reasonable doubt. This case is about caused, helped, encouraged. Kiara McCauley killed Grace Jennings around 1:30 in the afternoon on October 29th, 2022. After Isaac handed her the sword, it was Kiara that slashed and stabbed Grace on the bed in that garage until Grace was dead. Kiara is the principal in this case, the principal actor, but her accomplice, the partner that she was dependent on, was the long-standing architect of this murder. We know Kiara killed Grace Jennings. One, because she told us. We know that it was Kiara's DNA that could be recovered on the sword handle, and that the minor profile, the DNA that wasn't Kiara's, was also present, but it was too insufficient for further testing or conclusions. We know that Kiara's latent prints or fingerprints were the only ones that could be matched, and others were not sufficient for comparison. And we have been very clear about this position throughout the trial. Kiara killed Grace Jennings. But it is not required in this case that Isaac Apodaca inflicted any injuries on Grace for him to be guilty of first-degree murder under an aided and abetted theory. Isaac Apodaca is not accused of being the one that wielded the sword. But as I said, he aided and abetted, or was the accomplice or the helper in this crime, and he therefore can be held to be guilty of first-degree murder. And you will have two charges in front of you with a step down as to count one. You heard the judge talk about a second-degree murder option. Today this morning in this first portion of my discussion with you, I'm going to focus on the first-degree murder, as from the state's perspective, that is the appropriate charge for you to return a guilty verdict on. The state is asking you to convict on that first-degree murder because the deliberate intention or the willful and deliberate planning, premeditation that is evident throughout this case shows that there was planning, conversations, forethought, all put into the murder of Grace Jennings. So let's start with a quick timeline of kind of where people are and how their bodies are moving through this case. At 11:52, we have a message from Kiara to Isaac saying, "Did y'all just get to the garage?" From Kiara to Isaac, referencing Isaac and Grace. We know that Mr. Apodaca stated to Sergeant V. Hill that he thought that Grace arrived around, I think he said 11:42 or maybe it was 11:47 in the evening. At 12:04, we have the response of "I'm here." And that was Kiara after she'd left the park where she was initially waiting to initially commit this murder or maybe take Grace into the tunnels to do it. And after the defendant changed his plan, as Kiara spoke about, she then returned back to the house. And you'll see the messages in between when you review the evidence, if you'd like, about the back and forth about just come back here. But in terms of where Kiara was at 12:04 a.m., she had moved back to the location at 5941 Jaguar from the park. At 2 a.m., there's a message telling Isaac to go in the house for a bit, that Grace and Kiara talk for a while. We know that Kiara was really working through some mixed feelings on Grace, and in some ways felt bad for her, and in some ways was very much pulled into this homicidal delusion that Grace had somehow facilitated a gang rape of her years prior. At about 3 a.m., Isaac asks to come back in, so we know that he returns back into the garage. And then for the next several hours, as we know, they message back and forth about how they are going to kill Grace. The final message that we know is right before the murder is from Isaac Apodaca to Kiara on Facebook. And that's the one where he talks about she admitted it. and we know that it is the gang rape. This is kind of the final psychological blow that helps Kiara become enraged enough to finally push forward and kill Grace Jennings. At 1:34 p.m. on Isaac Apodaca's phone that we see in the Celebrate extraction from his actual physical device, the one that was taken off of him at AP Wireless, the one that Sergeant Vigil reviewed with him, there's a search of how to dispose of a body. At 1:42 in the afternoon, just shortly after that, that's when Isaac first calls his mom for help. He'd called her earlier about asking for a ride as part of Operation Fake Kickout, but at this point he calls his mom for help. Now, it's been a bit of a misnomer in this case that Isaac called 911, and let's be very clear, Isaac Apodaca never called 911. He called his mommy, and then his mom called 911, and then dispatch called Isaac and he didn't answer, and then eventually, after several minutes, he called them back. But Isaac did not go and run and ask for help from paramedics or first responders or law enforcement. His mom did. His mom is the one that kicked off the law enforcement response. Now, you're going to have a series of jury instructions. You just heard the court read them to you. And they're about as much fun to read as dishwasher assembly instructions and about as important to this case as the nuclear codes. So, have fun digging into those, but those are your roadmap. Those are the rules handed down to you from the court on what you have to find in this case and the rules that you have to follow. After count one in the instructions, we call those the element instructions, and we'll look at them in a minute, you'll see the definition of aided and abetted. And again, I think you're picking up on this and have throughout this case, that is what the defendant is being charged with. And that instruction states that the defendant may be found guilty of a crime even though he did not do the acts constituting the crime if the state proves to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt, a doubt based upon reason and common sense, that each of the following elements. Let's look at the murder instruction. The aided and abetted. 1, the defendant intended that another person commit the crime. Well, that is plainly evident in this case. Do it, just swing and don't regret the aim. Hours and hours of texting or messaging, handing her the sword, bringing Grace over. Of course this was intentional, and that was his goal all along. 2, another person committed the crime. Well, yep, that happened. Kiara McCauley killed Grace Jennings. And 3, the defendant helped, encouraged, or caused the crime to be committed. Caused, helped, encouraged, caused. So what crime are we talking about? What underlying offense do we have to prove happened? Well, we have to prove that there was a murder, that it was a first-degree murder. Murder in the first degree, this is called the elements instruction. You'll see the 1, 2, and 3. That the defendant killed Grace Jennings. Now, because of the aided and abetted instruction, this refers to the person who committed the actual crime, Kiara. But then the defendant, Mr. Apodaca, kind of stands in the shoes of Kiara under the aided and abetted theory. Kiara killed Grace Jennings. Yep. The killing was with the deliberate intention to take away the life of Grace Jennings or any other human being. We absolutely know that this was deliberate. This was intentional. This was a long, prolonged, planned event. And this happened in New Mexico on or about October 29th, 2022. I think this is probably the most undisputed element between myself and defense. We know it happened at 5941 Jaguar Drive on October 9th of 2022. We know that because of the police response, because of the autopsy, because of the messages, because of all of the evidence in this case. This happened here in the state of New Mexico on that date. Now, this deliberate intention, now this is what sets first-degree murder apart from second-degree murder. And this is what's so important that you understand that a first-degree murder was committed in this case. So a deliberate intention refers to the state of the mind of the defendant, Kiara, in this case, because she's the actual murderer. The deliberate intention may be inferred from all of the facts and circumstances around the killing. And the word deliberate means arrived at or determined upon as a result of careful thought, such as weighing out the pros and cons, maybe thinking about which weapons to use, weighing the consideration for and against the proposed course of action. Things like, how are we going to clean up the mess? Once this happens, it cannot be undone. These are all quotes from the messages and the exchanges between Mr. Apodaca and Kiara McCauley. And all of this information reflects that deliberate intention. This was not a rash, impulsive decision. This was a calculated judgment and a decision that can be arrived at in a short period of time, but in this case, wasn't. Why do we know that? We know that Kiara had homicidal fantasies fueled by the defendant, not for days, not for weeks, not for months, but for years. She had started believing this gang rape notion and started harboring hate in her heart for Grace for a very prolonged period. And one of the ways we know that is Kiana Aguilar. Kiana Aguilar stated that she was hanging out with Kiara 6 months to a year prior to the actual murder, and that Kiara talked about a plan for her and Isaac to lure Grace over and to kill her using a sharp-bladed instrument. So this was not some unconsidered rash impulse. This was an intent to kill, and it had been building and in the works for a very, very long time. It just so happened that the night that Grace needed somewhere to stay and reached out to someone that she thought was a friend or would be helpful is the final thing that made it all possible. And as I said, there has to be this weighing or this consideration of killing and the reasons for and against such a choice. Kiara acknowledged, I thought I had reasons. I felt I had reasons to kill Grace. And those reasons had been continually supplied and pushed and nudged by Isaac Apodaca. Count 2 is conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. The defendant and another, in this case Kiara, by words or acts agreed together to commit murder in the first degree. And the defendant and the other person intended to commit murder in the first degree, and again, this happened in New Mexico. Now, this part of the crime this crime is complete very, very early on in the evening. As they have formulated the plan, as they are continuing to work out the details, as they have brought Grace or had Grace procured, that conspiracy, that crime is complete very early on, and that's why it stands alone from the aided and abetted of the actual murder. The murder itself is not complete until Grace is dead. I think that's pretty common sense. So the conspiracy, count 2, is actually kind of first in time, and then the murder, which is a long aided and abetted process, caused, helped, or encouraged, you're going to hear me say that a painful number of times this morning, is from the beginning throughout until Grace is no longer with us. How do we know Grace died, and how do we know that Grace was murdered? We do have to prove that a murder occurred. Well, we talked to OMI, or Office of the Medical Investigator, Dr. Emily Helmrich. She performed the autopsy, and she located significant and devastating injuries all over Grace's body. There was over a dozen stab wounds and incised wounds, incised being the slice, stabs being kind of a poke or a penetrating wound. There were some that went in Grace's back, exited out her front. These wounds, once inflicted, which would take time to inflict, given the number and the direction and the range of these different types of wounds, once the fatal wounds were inflicted, it would have taken minutes to kill Grace. And we're not able to say, is minutes more than 1 minute? Is it more than 5, or is it more than 10? We don't know. And science and medicine have limits, but we know that it would have been minutes. We know that her lungs and liver and other organs were severely damaged, and that she died as a result of sharp force injuries. The cause and manner of death was the sharp force injuries and homicide. Now, also of note are that some of the injuries, many of them, the ones to the head and neck, the carotid injury, the slicing injuries kind of above the ears, a lot of those were post-mortem. So we heard throughout the case, and I don't want to go through every witness. I know you've taken notes, you've paid attention, but throughout the case, we have heard about our case agent, Sergeant Javier Vigil. Sergeant Vigil was on his way home, or about to head home after a SWAT call on October 29th, and he was the either lucky or unlucky individual to get tapped to take on this case for the Violent Crimes Unit. He responded to the scene, did a quick assessment, the scene was sealed, and then he began his interviews. He interviewed, as we know, Isaac Apodaca, Kiara McCauley, and in the days, weeks, months, and years that have followed, he has progressively built a case that you all have seen. He executed over 15 search warrants, some for the devices that he already had consent to search, but he decided to take a belt and suspenders approach to make sure that that information could get to all of us. He executed DNA warrants, which does help us understand that Kiara was the primary individual utilizing that sword. He interviewed witnesses that didn't end up having any relevance, just to rule them out. Even though Isaac Apodaca's confession and all of the evidence that Kiara McCauley was the killer could have potentially been a stopping point for him, he knew better and proceeded to build out a very full and very extensive case. That is why we have 91 plus exhibits to hand to you, because this was a complete and thorough investigation. As part of that investigation, he interviewed the defendant. Now, the defendant's interview, he had already been Mirandized by Cesar Ornelas at AP Wireless. But again, belt and suspenders, Sergeant Vigil Mirandized him, even though at that point, Isaac wasn't really a suspect. They thought that this could maybe just all be Kiara. They didn't have all the information because the investigation was developing. He read him his rights. He reviewed that form with him, as he does any other witness that is in a custodial interview, or an interview where he just is concerned that maybe it'll lead to a custodial interview, one where that they may not be able to leave by the end of the interview. And over about the 2.5-ish hours of the interview, right before, Isaac was given the opportunity to go get some water, bathroom breaks were allowed, the handcuffs were removed. Isaac initially gave a very lengthy version of events that placed the blame solely on Kiara, implied he had no idea that the murder was going to take place. He got teary. He breathed heavily. He seemed scared and nervous, which could just be that you're interviewing with the police, and sometimes the police are intimidating. But he really drew out a lot of details about how creepy and violent Kiara was being. Details that really don't play out in the rest of the evidence in this case. For example, he said that he had a butterfly knife drug across his face. No such butterfly knife was recovered. In fact, Kiara talked about that butterfly knife and said, "Oh no, I had lost that before that night." After his lengthy version of events that fully distance himself from the crime, that fully play into this notion that he had no idea that it was going to happen, he's just a boyfriend in this house trying to navigate a complex dynamic between these two ladies, and poor him, he's so traumatized. He ultimately agrees to go through his phone. And that decision was his to make. And whether that ultimately ended up being unwise is probably pretty evident. Maybe he just thought that they were only going to look at the messages between him and Grace. We don't know, and we can't speculate why he agreed. But he did. He gave a consent to search the phone. And we see as Sergeant Vigil sits down with him with the phone in hand as he kind of scrolls through it, and they begin talking about the messages. The messages between Kiara and Isaac, or the null void, and the Froggy McCullough account, he starts reviewing them kind of about 2/3 of the way through. It appears that he starts reviewing more after the series of little dog emojis that Kiara sent about 50 pages with. But somewhere in that range, Isaac Apodaca says, everything after this isn't me. She says, okay. They go back to the beginning. Well, at the very beginning, our messages that immediately began to trouble, and I think weird out, it may be the term that Sergeant Vigil uses, things that implicate Isaac very, very early on. From the early text about bringing Grace to the park versus the apartment, to the final messages of "she admitted it to me." He reviewed them with him. He gave him the opportunity to explain them. He went back through from that midpoint where he started at the beginning, and then ran back through. And then eventually, he confronted him with the inconsistencies that he was seeing. The defendant lied a lot in his interview. He lied about the reason for bringing Grace over, that he thought he could keep her safe. We know that the murder plot had long been in development and shifted on and off in terms of how throughout the evening. Because Kiara was already at the park when Grace was brought over. She was already dressed like a monster dude. She already had her sword with her. This plot had long been in place, and the defendant tried to lie and say that it was just to keep a friend safe. He said the conversations about cleaning up a mess were related to someone pooping in the bed that they were all laying in, and that if crime scene technicians looked through all the bedding, they would see human feces. Those messages are plainly about cleaning up the murder. Hydrogen peroxide and cold water washes to get blood and other evidence out. 2, I asked the crime scene technician about every piece of bedding that was in that garage, and none of it, thankfully, had human feces on it. You do have that evidence here if it is bloody and you would need to use your gloves and follow procedures to open it up. But if you want to inspect those items yourself, ladies and gentlemen, they've all been admitted as evidence for you. There's no poop in the bed. Isaac said that he didn't want anything to happen to Grace. But then he ultimately admitted that he did. It took a while for him to get there, but it was not the result of any coercion or threats or intimidation. It was just after being confronted with his lies over and over and over, and the nonsense that he was using to try and explain the text messages that he was clearly putting in a different context, not based on the reality of this case. He makes an admission.
Messages I just meant what I said.
So did you want Grace dead kind of because of all that?
I did.
Okay.
Did you want Grace dead because of all of that? Isaac responds, I did. He intended for the murder to happen. He's acknowledged in this case, in his statements and the messages, that he knew that Kiara had wanted to kill Grace for a very, very long time. As I mentioned, this was not a secret. Kiara said that she'd told multiple people and that she'd had lots of conversations with Isaac about it. This was not some shocking development. This was something that he had put into the works, that he was aware of, that he was facilitating. You heard some clips from some recorded conversations of the defendant while we're talking about his statements. He acknowledges in those calls that null void was one of his accounts. He tries to say that it was hacked, and there's no evidence of that. He tries to lay out a narrative that he didn't think anything was going to happen to Grace, which we know is contradicted. He said that Kiara had Russian KGB-style powers over him to trigger him, which seems nonsensical based on Kiara's testimony and appearance. It's your job to weigh the credibility of witnesses. And one of the things that you can consider is how they appear when they're testifying to you. I'm doubtful that she possesses KGB Russian spy-style skills of manipulation over someone. He insists he wasn't actually part of the planning. So this change in narrative from what he admits to in this police interview is reflective. And what does that reflect? It reflects that he's trying to shift the narrative and how that shows how manipulative Isaac Apodaca attempts to be. He tried to manipulate, and he did manipulate Kiara. He tried to manipulate Sergeant Vigil, and maybe it worked for a little while until the text messages were discovered, and he attempts to manipulate his mom in these recorded calls. So this case has a lot of messages, Facebook and text messages or SMS messages, ones that are sent from a phone number to a phone number, as opposed from a Facebook account to another Facebook account. Who sent them? Well, when you look, you will see that all Isaac's phone. We know that because we see Sergeant Vigil scrolling through the conversation as it's housed on Isaac's actual physical device. We know from the Celebrate extraction that Facebook Messenger was being used during that entire time frame on Isaac Apodaca's phone to send Facebook messages, the ones that Sergeant Vigil had received. So we know that there wasn't some other device that had hacked into that account. It was his phone accessing that account throughout that entire conversation. We know from the Facebook search warrant of the records as they're housed at Meta in California or wherever their servers are, that those are the conversations with identifying features that show that it was Isaac Apodaca communicating with Kiara McCauley, including that the null void account was discovered as it was linked or attached to Isaac Apodaca's other account, which was labeled Isaac Apodaca, as Sergeant Vigil stated. And I've referenced common sense. You are individuals that we assume possess reason and the ability to utilize common sense. It would be nonsensical to believe that Kiara McCauley spent 14 hours in possession of Isaac Apodaca's phone or accessing his accounts and his phone, and was sitting there texting herself back and forth about a murder plot over the period of 15 hours with some of those messages seconds or milliseconds apart. That's nonsense. Common sense dictates that there are two individuals having those conversations, and that those two individuals are Kiara McCauley and Isaac Apodaca. And then, of course, we have Isaac's own admissions. He admitted ultimately to Sergeant Vigil that he, in fact, was the sender. Now, this picture is on page 66 of the Facebook message return. It was sent about 5:44 a.m. In his police interview, Isaac Apodaca identifies that as himself as he's laying across the foot of the bed. And when I reference page 66, it's, if you choose to review those records, it'll be as it's notated in the top right corner of the records return, not page 66 of the PDF itself. This was sent at 5:44 a.m. from Kiara to Isaac. As we know, Isaac identified himself. And what you can see in this picture, although it's blurry, you can see Isaac Apodaca's face at about, if this was a clock face, about the 3 o'clock on the image. And what's interesting about this is that you can see there's a light coming up from below and lighting kind of the underside of his left cheek. And why is there a light there, ladies and gentlemen? Because he possessed his own cell phone during this time frame. This is one other piece of cross-corroboration that these individuals are the ones who are plotting and planning, that Isaac Apodaca is actively participating, he's encouraging, he's causing, he's helping. Let's talk about Kiara McCauley. I believe I told you in my opening statement that Kiara would come across as strange, as potentially kind of a broken or troubled person, and maybe as someone who would do anything for love. We know that she was 19 years old at the time of the murder. We know that they were residing in the garage because Isaac wanted her away from her mom. We know that she believed Isaac for a whole slew of reasons, including a belief that he could potentially be the Archangel Gabriel or a voice box for the Archangel Gabriel, because he knew things about her that nobody else knew. Her deepest, darkest secrets, she believed he knew. We know that his nickname for her was Puggle or Puggy. You see that throughout the messages, and that she called him Otter. Kiara came pursuant to her plea agreement, and she testified before you. As I said, the credibility of every single witness is for you to decide. And I would assert that Kiara, for all of her flaws, for all of her difficult to understand personality traits, was credible. Now, she took a plea. Kiara McCauley, and you have that plea paperwork in the exhibits, has previously pleaded guilty to aggravated second-degree murder, which is a lesser offense of count 1, and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. And I want to be really clear here. Just because she took a plea to aggravated second-degree murder, that doesn't mean that that's the only level of crime that she committed. Kiara McCauley absolutely committed first-degree murder. But in exchange, as a bargained for exchange for her cooperation, she was allowed to plead to a lesser, a step down charge. So that does not necessarily mean that she only committed aggravated second-degree murder. She didn't. She acknowledged that she committed willful and deliberate first-degree murder by talking about her reasons to do so, the planning, and all of the steps she took. This is a bargain for exchange. She also, as I said, pleaded to the conspiracy to commit first-degree murder due to the words and acts that she and Isaac engaged in to plot things. We heard from Dr. Michael Wellner, and boy, is he a talker. He's an expert in forensic psychiatry, and he loves to talk about his job and all of the conclusions that he has drawn. And he gave us 3 psychiatric or psychological themes to consider. And the first one is coercive control. And this relates to the research on people who are drawn into sex work by their partners. He said that as that happens, much like happened here, that Kiara was drawn into prostituting herself on Skip the Games and escort website, with Isaac Apodaca keeping the money, that a dependence forms But the female, in this case, loses personal agency or their ability to make choices and determinations for themselves. They get pulled into the financial support of their partner because their partner takes the money and keeps it. It leads to dominance, a theme throughout this case. It leads to secrecy, like we see in Kiara keeping the ongoing sex work a secret from Lanny after Lanny told both her and Isaac that the sex work had to stop. And the lead up to this coercive control dynamic is that it leads to further traumatic events. And as this goes on, the benefit throughout all of this, there's evident throughout this case, is there's a benefit to the dominant person. And there can be a economic or financial benefit, right? Your girlfriend goes and has sex for money and you take the money and are able to buy Gundam models or whatever you want with it and control the financial aspects of the relationship. But there's also a psychological benefit, and that's power and that's control. Now, as I said, this coercive control dynamic leads to traumatic events, and we see that in this case. We know that Kiara McCauley was sexually assaulted in the course of her sex work on Halloween of 2021. We know that because Lanny took her for her rape kit. And we know that because of other statements in this case. Now, forensic psychiatry understands the notion of the idea of staying together even after a sexual assault, such as in the course of prostitution that one's partner has encouraged, or getting back together even after a violent domestic violence episode where maybe someone has their thumb broken or is beaten very badly. These encounters can lead to trauma bonding. And one of the hallmarks is that the submissive person begins to internalize or take on in their own mind, heart, body, what have you, the dominant person's perspective. Things like not agreeing to continue on with a criminal case because you don't want it to hurt your partner. And you think about the benefits or the challenges that could pose for them as opposed to your own safety, your own security, your own health. We also heard about the term gaslighting, which is, I think, a pretty trendy term we hear a lot. I accuse my husband of it every time he leaves the toilet seat up and tells me he didn't. Apparently, I'm misusing that. Gaslighting is a much deeper psychological concept, and that involves convincing an individual of things that lead them to questioning their own reality, such as telling someone that you saw a video of them on the dark web of them being gang raped and an ex accepting money for it. And you begin to take on that absolutely distorted reality over the process of being gaslighted for a period of time. And we know that this coercive control dynamic, the elements of trauma bonding, and the gaslighting that went on is what fueled so much of Kiara's rage, her hatred for Grace, her conflicted feelings about Grace, because on the one hand, she still kind of loved her. On the other hand, she's grown to believe that this person is a monster who pimped her out to a bunch of men for money and is a sex trafficker. The gaslighting can lead to the belief that your individual is essentially a vigilante sex trafficking serial killer who's founded a group called Ghost. All of these distorted realities derive from the coercion, the trauma bonding, the control, the very toxic, I think is how Kiana Aguilar described the relationship dynamic, the dynamic that was present on October 28th into the 29th between Kiara and Isaac. So the domestic violence and the sex work are being offered to you for a very limited purpose, and you have an instruction on this. It's important that you follow that instruction and only consider this evidence for the purpose that the judge has allowed you to consider it in those instructions. It's permitted to show the defendant's intent on October 28th, 2022. So we're not saying because he beat her up in April of 2022, on that date in April, he thought, 6 months from now, I'm going to be able to get her to murder someone. It's the intent on the date of the incident. Based on their past interactions, he knew what he could push Kiara to do. Things that are...
Hold on a second, Counsel. Again, everyone, before we continue, please check and make sure your phones are off.
We knew that he could push Kiara to do things that an average person would not do. An average person does not hear that their partner has formed a Ghost and has a a kill count of 40 and there are kill lists made for them without any sort of other corroboration or evidence, and just believes them. He knew, based on these prior experiences, what he could get Kiara to do. Things that aren't smart or in her best interest or safe. He could compel her. It's also relevant for you to consider for their relationship dynamic and how it led to this. Now, Dr. Wellner talked about a series of inducements or benefits and a series of persuasions that are absolutely visible throughout the Facebook messages and the SMS messages. I'm not going to talk about every single one. You have those messages. We've heard them at times, or at length, excuse me. The first one is that, in terms of a benefit that she would derive, is that she would move up the ranks in Ghost, and she would get perks on the black market. That was sent about 3:38 p.m., that's on page 37 of the Facebook records. At 5:55 a.m., on page 68, is, I just want you to do it so you can feel that rush of adrenaline. Adrenaline makes you feel good. He was trying to say, kill Grace and you'll feel better. We see that even more. So these are two of the inducements or the benefits, the power, the money, the sense of belonging in this organization that she could derive. And she believed in this organization so much that she let Isaac Apodaca tattoo her with some sort of insignia or ranking symbol on her body. Persuasions. He told her to use the dagger because it's blunt, and blunt cuts like butter. A little bit confusing, but it's what he said at 3:10 a.m. on page 35. The death will be instant. And this is after she said, well, will it be instant? He said, yeah. Just aim. At 3:52 a.m. on page 55 of the records, he goes into a bit hitting on the Grace gang rape fantasy delusion. She sold you into the sex trade. Just swing and don't regret the aim. This is a short list. There are dozens of examples throughout these messages of him engaging in persuasions. And what's another word for persuasions? Encouragement. And again, ladies and gentlemen, helped, caused, and encouraged. We know he helped Grace Jennings. We know he did not help Grace Jennings. We know that he helped Kiara McCauley. We know through the lens of Dr. Michael Wellner how he's able to get her to do this, how he's able to cause this murder to ultimately happen. And we know he encouraged over and over and over again. And you can see in those messages times where Kiara backs off or says, can you do it? Or what about this? She ultimately was agreeing to Operation Kickout when he sends that final message to really try and push her and then hands her the sword. Over and over again, he aids and abets the first-degree murder, and that's why he's guilty of first-degree murder. One of the ones from the text messages on the phone itself, and this is right around the time in the Facebook messages, one of them tells the other one to switch to text. You may remember that I had Sergeant B. Hill point that out. You'll see around 6 a.m. in the messages, which unfortunately you're going to have to work on converting from UTC to local time. There's a message that says text, like switch to text. And around that time, he states, Isaac Apodaca from his cell phone, with the dagger, bring it up, turn flat, south to north, and with hilt east to west. She says something in response, and then he says, then turn it blade east to west, hilt north to south, and voila, she dead. This reflects, again, the intentionality behind these acts. There is no doubt that they were plotting all of the different ways that they could kill Grace Jennings and all the ways that they could ultimately clean up for it. Puggle, I'm wanting you to kill her. You have to end your suffering by ending her joy. This is an explicit reference to the suffering that Kiara felt that she had suffered from Grace. At times in the messages, Kiara talks about, I'm hurting, babe. Can you please get rid of her? This is too much for me. And then at times, of course, she does actively participate because she's so tied into this delusion and the fantasy and the inducements and the persuasions. But at 6:06 a.m., Puggle, I'm wanting you to kill her. You have to end your suffering by ending her joy. There is no other way to read that message. As I said, Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, we know that the defendant's intent was for Kiara to murder Grace because he told her to do it repeatedly, and he kept trying to push her buttons over and over. It's a little bit like if someone has a key ring with a bunch of keys, and they're trying to undo a lock, and they try the first key and it doesn't work, so they shift to the second key and it doesn't work, and they keep trying and trying and trying until they find the key and the lock catches and the door opens. He knew which keys to use, and that's because he knew her particularized psychological weak points. This was because of he was her intimate partner, and it was someone over whom he had tremendous influence, tremendous control. We know that Kiara committed the murder willfully and deliberately. It was not an accident. It was not a rash impulse. It was not heat of passion. This was a pre-planned event, and it just took the right key in the lock to finally push them through the door. We know that she had these homicidal intentions, as I stated, not for minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years. And she had begun believing that gang rape story years in advance of this. I believe she said about 6 months into dating Isaac. That's when he began planting these seeds. We know that, as I said, she was vocal with others about it. She may have pleaded to aggravated second-degree murder, but Kiara McCauley absolutely committed first-degree murder willfully and deliberately. She premeditated it, and she had a lot of help and encouragement in getting there. Every time she resisted, every time she asked questions, every time she asked for him to help, he backs off momentarily, and then he comes back with a new key, a new approach. Isaac Apodaca brought Grace Jennings to that apartment where he resided with his homicidal, delusional girlfriend. Isaac Apodaca repeatedly urged for that murder to happen. He promised to be helpful in the charge of cleaning up. He handed Kiara the sword. He did not need to be present in the room for him to be guilty of first-degree murder. There is no requirement in the uniform jury instructions, the rules that you've been handed, that he swing that sword, that he be present in the room at the exact instance of the murder. It is about him and the ways he communicated the cause, the help, the encouragement. Ladies and gentlemen, your job is to apply the facts of this case, not to judge Kiara McCauley's culpability and try and weigh out some sort of apples to apples decision as to, well, if she took a plea, no. Her bargain for exchange stands on its own. Your job in this case is to look at Isaac Apodaca and his role in this case, to look at Isaac Apodaca and look at all of the causation, the encouragement, the help that he performed that led to Grace Jennings dying in that disgusting garage on October 29th of 2022. And as you apply those facts, this evidence to the law in this case, you will find that he is guilty of first-degree murder under an aided and abetted theory, and you will find that he is guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. I thank you for your time and attention, and I'll get the opportunity to speak to you again soon.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned in between the closing statements, we're going to take a quick recess. This will be our bathroom break for the morning. We'll come back and continue.